All right, so this is the awesome Henry Clay, of course, and he's giving his speech for the Compromise of 1850, part of which you read. So can you remind me of those features of the Compromise of 1850? Fugitive Slave Act, California entered as a free state, popular sovereignty for the rest of the Mexican Cession, very good. Congress cannot abolish slavery. The slave trade is ended in D.C. And the part about us not having a civil war going on over here in these parts. We're going to pay off Texas's debts and then force Texas to accept our the border that we want them to accept. Okay? So the Compromise of 1850 occurs and temporarily solves the problem and keeps the country together. But there are still lots more problems to come. For example, in the North, the opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act is quick, and in many cases it is violent. So there are going to be like big protests that are going to occur. They're going to, have mass meetings where they warn the like free black populations of the North like to stay away from any law enforcement. Many states are going to pass things called personal liberty laws, basically saying that people have a right to follow their own conscience, and that the states, like New York, for example, won't use any state resources to prosecute them. But nevertheless, there is a surge of slave catchers coming into the North from these southern states on the lookout for escaped slaves. But again, remember, this is a time without fingerprint identification or DNA testing or birth certificates or so on. So more often than not, we have people who are actually free blacks who are being captured and sort of forced into slavery, under the pretense that they were an escaped slave. And remember that those judges established under the Fugitive Slave Act are actually paid more when they find that a person is in fact an escaped slave, as opposed to when they find the person is a free black. So there's a whole bunch of animosity that goes on, and although I hope that we all oppose the idea of a Fugitive Slave Act because slavery is wrong, at the same time, we want to at least recognize that when the South says that it was the North who violated the Constitution first, they're kind of right. Because it's the North who is openly disobeying federal law, like passing state laws saying we will not comply with this law. If the national government wants to do this, they'll have to come and do it themselves. At a time when both the Constitution and the law says that they were supposed to be returning fugitive slaves. So, I mean, it's one thing to stand up for morality, but you can at least understand how the South begins to panic a little bit at this point. We know that the two-party system is really struggling, especially after Henry Clay and Daniel Webster sadly take a moment of silence for our favorite statesman. Our time with him has come to an end. Don't worry, we'll talk about him all year. Have died, and in their place there are really no congressmen up to the task of finding compromises. The new congressmen, the new leaders of the U.S. House and Senate are going to be much more sort of married to their sectional interests, or to the idea of refusing to compromise or standing up to the corruption in Congress. The Whig Party will basically dissolve after the Compromise of 1850. Because the Whigs don't take a strong stance on slavery, the Whigs are fragmented. Some of them oppose it, some of them like it, and so the party itself will fall apart and will not be nationally competitive anymore. Then as abolitionism grows, the sort of biggest thing we can point to here is going to be the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. Now this is written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. She is the daughter of Lyman Beecher, who was a major figure in which big movement? The temperance movement, very good. And so, P.S., Uncle Tom's Cabin is a terrible work of literature. It is painful to read. There are all kinds of tropes and just sort of sugary sweet. They have zero it's really, really challenging to read. But on the other hand, it humanizes the idea of slavery. And from our perspective, we're going, I mean, didn't everybody know that slaves were humans? But remember that before this period, up through all the way through the 1840s, although there are abolitionists in the North, they represented a very small minority of the northern population, right? It is still seen as a fringe movement. These are sort of fanatics who are not really in touch with reality. And many, many more Northerners just sort of feel indifferent about slavery. Well, whatever, we don't have it here. They get mad if the South tries to force them to support it, but they don't really oppose it of their own accord. But when they start to read Uncle Tom's Cabin, I mean, I just can't even get over the sarcasm associated with this. But they read Uncle Tom's Cabin. slaves are people too, and this Uncle Tom was such a nice guy, and he saved the little girl, and then she loved him, and then he got sold because of a debt, and then he got beaten to death, and he's a nice guy, and he forgave his, mean master on his death. I've told the entire story to you. That's literally all there is to the story. Like people, they just sort of have this empathy for this completely fictional character, by the way. Uncle Tom is not a real person. It's just a character in the book. And so we begin to see more in the North begin to speak out. I guess I can sort of liken it to, do you guys remember last year when the photograph of the young Syrian, the little 2-year-old Syrian boy who died in the crossing and his body washed up on a beach? And sort of how nobody had really been paying attention to the Syrian refugee crisis, which had been going on for more than 2 years at that point. All of a sudden, people are paying attention and talking about it and saying we've got to help. It's kind of a similar thing. It's not like it wasn't bad before. It's that for whatever reason, this work of literature got people to go, oh my gosh, this is terrible. We actually do this to people. We're selling and buying human beings and beating them. This is a bad thing. So influential was it that first off, the South began to ban the book. So it became a capital offense in the South to be caught trying to send the book Uncle Tom's Cabin by mail. So you weren't allowed to distribute the book in the South. And then once the Civil War begins, at one point Harriet Beecher Stowe meets with Abraham Lincoln, who will at that point be our president. And his words, what he says is, oh, so you're the little lady who started this big war. And so although, again, we're kind of going, really? A terrible work of, fiction is going to start this big war. But in fact, it was hugely impactful simply because although I would argue that the idea of abolitionism is still a minority movement in the North, even after Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's a much bigger and much more vocal movement after this book, because people now are going to be much more passionate about the idea, and it's going to have affected more people in general. Okay, now we get to our arch nemesis, Stephen Douglas. So Stephen Douglas did one good thing in his life. His sort of freshman year in Congress, he did help Henry Clay to pass the Compromise of 1850. He was young, Clay was old, Clay couldn't run around the halls of Congress trying to convince people to do stuff because he was old. So Douglas did a lot of the sort of footwork as part of the process, but Douglas had ambition. Douglas really wanted to be president. Stephen Douglas is a Democrat. He's the same guy who's the Lincoln-Douglas debate guy, but that hasn't happened yet. This is 1854. That is until he's 58. Anyway, so Douglas wants to be president. He's a Democrat, and he knows that the only way for him to be president is to have national support. So Douglas is from Illinois. He has plenty of support in the West. He's got some friends in the North, but he doesn't have a lot of support in the South. And so he decides that the way that he's going to get national support is by, first he's going to get national fame by being the guy who helps to pass the Transcontinental Railroad Bill, finally. Remember, what's the debate over the Transcontinental Railroad Bill? Where's it going to go, right? It's going to be the northern route. It's going to be the southern route. Remember, we bought the Gadsden Purchase for the sole purpose of being a place for the Southern Railroad. The Southern Railroad would, of course, have been easier to build, would have to go through so many mountains. Right, so what route are we going to do? Douglas is from the West, right? So he actually wants sort of a central route, which he thinks will be kind of a compromise. So that's how he wants to get his fame. But in order to pass that bill, he's got to do something to convince the South to vote for him, right? To vote for this bill, this Transcontinental Railroad Bill. So he wants to do something for the South, and he comes up with what we call the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And in doing so, he spits on the grave of his mentor and the world's greatest politician that ever existed, Henry Clay. Here's what he does. So remember that the Missouri Compromise in 1820 had established that southern boundary of Missouri as being sort of the dividing line between free and slave states in the Louisiana Territory. Now we know that since then we've had the Mexican Cession, and all this is popular sovereignty because of the Compromise of 1850 and so on. But remember, just because the Compromise of 1850 didn't extend the Missouri line doesn't mean it abolished it, right? Because even after the Compromise of 1850, all that territory that had been decided on in 1820 was still supposed to be free and slave. The southern part, Arkansas and part of Oklahoma, had already been organized. At this point, Arkansas was a state. But what was left of the northern Louisiana Territory, the part that was supposed to be free by the Compromise of 1820, had not yet become states. They'd only organized as far as Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory. And so Stephen Douglas says this. He says, popular sovereignty worked so well for us in the Compromise of 1850. Why don't we reestablish this, what's left of the Louisiana Purchase, this Kansas-Nebraska territory? Let's reestablish them on the basis of popular sovereignty. Well, think for a moment about how the Northerners are feeling. Remember, the Northerners have just, 4 years prior, been asked to enforce slavery and like had to face civil penalties themselves so they don't like cooperate with this thing that they believe is evil. And now 4 years later, you're telling them that this land that by law had been guaranteed to be free, that they had assumed was free, that people had moved into under the assumption that it was free, that all of a sudden you're going to change that just to make the South happy. The North feels betrayed. How dare you undo that thing we agreed upon? I mean, let's take a moment to like recognize the irony when this is exactly what we've done to the Native Americans for the entirety of American history. But anyway, the Northerners are feeling like, how dare you sign a law and agree to this and then change your mind, right? Meanwhile, the Southerners, it works for Stephen Douglas anyway, the Southerners are ecstatic, right? We could get another slave state. We could easily turn Kansas Territory into a slave territory because we've got Missouri right nearby, we've got Arkansas, we can move people in. If we know that we can have slavery here, like we can get this accomplished, we can have another slave state. That will help us to gain a little bit more of an advantage, politically speaking. And so the result of Mr. Douglas's ambition was the beginnings, really, of the Civil War. Most historians consider what comes next, called Bleeding Kansas, to be the precursor to the real Civil War, to the full Civil War, because what happens is that fighting breaks out. Southerners began, so first of all, everyone who was already in Kansas Territory tended to be free soilers, right? They did not have slaves because prior to this law, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that territory had been considered free under the Missouri Compromise. So all of a sudden now we have this big push of, they're called pro-slaveryites, these pro-slavery forces that are pushing into Kansas Territory from Missouri and from Arkansas. And they're all kinds of like organizations where they pool money to try to like help people move into Kansas Territory. They even have like sort of sneaky schemes where it's like, hey, go and move to Kansas and stay there just for long enough for the vote, and then we'll keep your farm going back here and you can move back as soon as the vote happens, you know, like let's get another one for the South or whatever it is. So meanwhile, then all of a sudden the free soilers in Kansas are feeling they're under attack. And so they beg for help, and so now we're seeing free soilers come in from places like Ohio and Illinois and Indiana and so on, and they're pushing into Kansas trying to push back against these slavery forces. We see bloodshed. John Brown, who you've read about so far with the raid at Harper's Ferry, he actually first comes to infamy in Kansas Territory because he and his sons, they go into this like pro-slavery town in Kansas at a place called Pottawatomie Creek. It's kind of fun to say, Pottawatomie Creek. And so at Pottawatomie Creek, he and his sons, they literally hack an entire family of pro-slavery forces people to death. And like the creek runs red with blood. It's pretty graphic. Anyway, and they sort of like ride off in the sunset. It sort of culminates into a debate over the Kansas Constitution. So pretty quickly, Kansas has enough people to apply for statehood because of all this, inpouring of people, both free free soilers and pro-slaveryites. So they're going to have a vote to decide whether or not they want their constitution to be in favor of slavery or against. Well, pretty quickly it becomes apparent that the pro-slavery forces are going to rig this vote, right? They're sending in all kinds of people from Missouri just for the day to like cast their ballots, and they're like have armed people, trying to stop things. So they're going to try to get in the way of things. Well, the free soilers, they basically boycott the election. Well, when you boycott an election, you definitely lose, just in case you were wondering. And so we'll pick up on that part of the story tomorrow.